May I ask you to take a seat, please? And we would like to get started. Also, in the interest of the people following this as a live stream, so this will be recorded. So welcome to Johns Hopkins, the Center of Alternatives to Animal Testing. For those who don't know me, Thomas Hartung. I have the pleasure now for almost 11 years to direct this. There's a moment in time, which is in 2002, which connects the speaker of today and myself, which is when Michael Balls did retire from as the first and inaugurating chair or the head of the European Center for Validation of Alternative Methods of the European Commission, as you can see here. And I had the privilege to become his successor, which made alternative methods, which was always a part of my research, my topic since 2002. You can see here, shortly after, we had this meeting at ECVAM. You see I was hardly filling my suit at the time, which is not the case anymore. Okay, I don't want to take any time of our speaker. Michael is, I think, the preeminent promoter of alternative methods over the last decades. He has been really spearheading these discussions. Many have been inspired by his work, and he has continued to work after he retired from ECVAM via FRAME, via his involvement in ATLA, the Journal for Alternatives to Laboratory Animals. So he is really a figure. We owe a lot, all of us in this field. And there was nobody else more suitable to choose for an event like we were having on Friday on 60 years of the 3 Rs. And I could not resist to take advantage of this, to have a longer period of listening to him, giving us some of the lessons learned here as the starter for our board meeting. So Michael, we're looking very much forward to hear from you, what you have to tell us from all these years in the field. And I'm moving you over here. So here you should. Is this the one?
Oh, yeah.
Good. I think
Okay.
This is correct. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today and an honor. And it's great to see some old friends here. And I can say old in two ways. Both they've been friends for a long while, but most of us are not quite so young as we once were. I first came to Baltimore in 1964 to a meeting at Hopkins. I was on my way to be a postdoc in California, and I loved this city then, and I've loved it ever since. I've been back here many times, usually to CAAT meetings, where I've learned a huge amount and been very grateful for it. But I've also had wonderful contacts with the HSUS and more recently with IIVS. I want to try and do too much today by talking partly to people who aren't all that familiar with the detail of what's been going on, but also to say something to the people who are. And let's see how we get on. I've got a rather dramatic conclusion, which I thought of at about 2 o'clock this morning. I'm not sure I'll have the courage to end with it, but let's see how we get on. In 1996, at the Second World Congress, I used the... Somebody's not working here. It's working there, but not here. Okay. In 1996, I used the great ages of European civilization to look at the progress of the alternatives. But what's happened in recent years is that, like all analogies, it kind of broke down. And that's how I want to kind of finish up today. So let's see how we get on. So in the early 1950s, and people in England in particular were concerned about the great increase in animal use in experiments after the Second World War. And people started to talk about why it was done, how it was done, and whether it was necessary. At that time, the control of animal experimentation was based on the Cruelty to Animals Act of 1876. And what the law really did was to prevent anybody who used animals in recognized experiments from being prosecuted for cruelty to animals. Lots of suggestions were put forward, and one really significant move led eventually to the 3 Rs. Hume was the head of an organization called EUFOR, the European Federation for Animal Welfare. He was a marvelous man. He was involved in all kinds of great projects, but he had been an army officer in the First World War, and he saw sacrifice as something worthwhile, as long as the cause was good. And he even accepted, of course, as an army officer, that the sacrifice could be made by his men, not perhaps by him. And he felt, I think, about animals in the same way. If the animals were going to be used in good experiments and were treated properly, that use was justifiable. He succeeded in persuading EUFOR to set up a project. Their main activity had been to produce a handbook on how laboratory animals should be treated, which was first produced in 1947, and it's been very successful. And I think the 9th or 10th edition is now being prepared. I've got a bit of a... Okay. He persuaded EUFOR to have a project which would look at the humanity involved in animal experimentation, and William Russell was appointed to undertake the research. And eventually, after a struggle, Hume was able to persuade the organization to appoint Rex Birch in order to help Russell do the work. Birch recorded interviews with about 100 scientists, and he sent the tapes back to Russell in London. Russell had a typist turn them into TypeScript, and he used them when he wrote what was eventually going to be the book, The Principles of Humane Experimental Technique, which was published in 1959. This is Russell and Birch. This was at a meeting held in Sheringham, England in 1995, organized by Alan Goldberg and me, which was one of the first occasions that they had met since the book had been published more than 30 years earlier. And this is the book, published in 1959, sold very small number of copies, wasn't really noticed. There were few reviews of it which weren't particularly positive, and really nobody took much notice. What they did was they defined humanity in a really interesting way, and they thought that the way of dealing with inhumanity was to reduce the number of animals used to the minimum necessary, to refine the procedures applied to them in order to minimize suffering, and where possible, to replace them altogether. Rex Birch was a gentle, charming man. He only stayed with the project for about a couple of years, and he then went off to set up his own microbiology laboratory. The people at EUFOR weren't particularly nice to him. He wanted to be a member of the Institute of Biology, which was the kind of professional organization for biologists at that time. But EUFOR didn't really support him. They said he was just a technician, a dog's body, collecting the data for Russell, who was the real person involved. Russell, however, was extremely loyal to Birch and insisted that Rex Birch should get full recognition of what he'd done, and indeed should be a co-author of the book and have a share of the royalties. The royalties over the first few years, until the the remaining copies were sold, would probably have been a couple of $100 or something. So he wasn't actually sharing very much with Birch. Bill Russell was a completely amazing character. He was involved in all kinds of things. Everything he did with unbelievable enthusiasm. He could have been a concert pianist. He wrote operas. He was an entertainer. He appeared on radio quiz shows. He was a psychotherapist. He did all kinds of things. Everything he did was of a very high quality, and he invested a huge amount of time in it. My theory of how he worked is that he could do one thing and then drop it and move on to something else, and kind of totally concentrate on that until he moved on to the next thing. His father was a very distinguished scientist who was the head of the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. He went to public school. He started at Oxford, but then went into the army. And he refused to be an officer because he felt he would rather be with the men on the front line than be behind the lines, kind of telling them what to do. He read zoology at Oxford. His tutor was Peter Medawar, who got a Nobel Prize. His PhD work was supervised by a lovely gentleman called Needham, but Tinbergen, who also got a Nobel Prize, was really one of the pioneers in animal behavior research, which was going on, and I think Russell benefited enormously from that. He then, of course, spent from 1954 to 59 with U4, and after that, he became a psychotherapist without any training, probably, with the guidance of his wife, Claire, who had a big reputation in that field. I shall come in a moment to the jobs he tried to get, which is a very interesting part of the story. He died in 2006, and a young Canadian journalist called Cleo Pascal telephoned me and said she'd inherited this house full of all the possessions of Bill and his wife Claire, and she didn't know what to do with them. So I said to her, do nothing until I've talked to the University of Nottingham, and let's see if they would be interested in setting up an archive so that all his books and papers would be protected and could be made available to scholars in the year to come. I then went to see the house in which they lived, which I'll come to in a moment, and we found about 25,000 books, probably about 20,000 box files in every conceivable space in the house you could imagine. How they found anywhere to live, I don't actually know. Alan went and saw it, and I think agrees with me on that. I've just been there actually with John Pascandola, who's here today. We share an interest in what happened in particular in the early days of the 3 Rs, and we've just actually written an article on our latest findings, which we've submitted to ATLA. The house in Reading, which is just about half an hour outside London, had 2 stories and an attic, a huge attic, and they also had a garage. Now this is his study, and there were books. There was only one place to sit on that chair. The rest of it was covered in books and papers. This is the kitchen, and you can't, if you look in the front there was just enough space for a plate and a knife and fork and a glass. All the books on the kitchen table were being read at the same time. They all had bookmarks in them. And I think what he did was he read a chapter in one and moved on to the next one and gradually went around, 100 books until he got to the end. This is a bedroom full of papers, and this is the garage with the car on the right and papers everywhere. So there was a room where Claire, his wife, had her records as a psychotherapist. I just had a look at a couple of files and refused to look at another one and got out. I didn't really know humans behaved like that. And she had all this incredible detail of what they'd done and what they needed to talk to her about. He never had a computer. He never had a television set. He never had an electric typewriter. He never had a mobile telephone. He did everything on a manual typewriter. And every time it got worn out, he just put it behind the desk and bought a new one. And behind his desk were about 12 typewriters, just sitting there for the rest of time. The same applied to vacuum cleaners. When a vacuum cleaner went wrong, they bought a new one and used it, and the others all just sat there waiting for, I don't know what. Now, after the book was published in 1959, there's what I call the Age of Darkness. The book was more or less totally ignored. There were a few polite comments about it, and there are some amazing things about it. First of all, UFO, which had sponsored the project, did very little to promote either the sales of the book or the 3 R's concept. And I want to say my theory about this, because although I work with John, we haven't yet checked on every conclusion we can agree on yet. He may well disagree with me on some points, being a historian, whereas I'm just a scientist. I think UFO must have been shocked by the book, because the book really ended up saying that the only real way forward was replacement. That wasn't what UFO wanted to hear. UFO was really a refinement organization. One of the people on the committee for the project was the head of a lab whose job was to advise the Medical Research Council on the production of rats and mice for use in labs. And I think it's very interesting that the book's copyright was owned by Bill Russell. It was a UFO project. He was appointed by them to do the work. He submitted a report to them. How on earth was it that he got to publish the book and publish a book where he owned the copyright? I think it's really quite amazing. He had great difficulty in the early 1960s in finding a job. And the files are full of letters from him in which he applied for all kinds of jobs. Some of them were ridiculous. He completely lacked the qualifications for them, or they were for people with far less experience than he had. At this time, the English universities more than doubled in number in the early 1960s. I, as a postdoc in Portland, Oregon, applied for a job in England and received the offer of a tenured position by telegram with 48 hours in which to accept it or not. If that could happen to me, who was nobody at the time, how could he possibly not have found a good job in one of the universities? And I personally think that either openly or covertly, I think, and people were warned that he might well be a difficult character who would cause problems if they took him on. So that's one of the unexplained things. Why did he find it so difficult to find a job? Happily for him, in 1966, a new department of sociology was established at the University of Reading, and he got a job there, spent the rest of his life there, was extremely successful, and was greatly valued by the department and the university. And of course, during that time, he seemed to have paid little or no attention to the 3 R's at all. He organized a meeting in 1957 for the Laboratory Animals Bureau. He kind of mentioned the 3 R's, but really this day conference was held, and the concept was hardly mentioned at all. The discussions were really all about the statistics of animal use and how animals should be used. Hume was extremely rude about the draft of the book and said it needed to be drastically revised because it was almost unreadable in places and so on. But I think Russell resisted those pressures and went ahead and insisted on the publication of the book as it was. I don't think Birch had anything to do with the writing of the book and its publication. It's unlikely, perhaps, that he even saw a draft of it. This was Russell's own initiative, his decision. He was in charge of it on his own. And I think that's one of the reasons why, at one level, it's a terrible book, which in places is unreadable. It's also a fantastic book, because it has so many great ideas in it. And every time I look at it, I find something new and rewarding that I hadn't noticed before. I try to help people whose first language isn't English by writing an abridged version, which has actually been translated into Chinese and Korean with the support of IVS. And 10,000 copies went to India. And it was quite marvelous actually going through, kind of deciding which pieces were essential to the development of his ideas and which were kind of peculiar detail which nobody could really understand particularly well at distance and could be omitted. A response from the scientific community. This is a book by Sir William Peyton, and he says that the public should realize that adherents of the 3 R's usually have the objective of total and unconditional replacement of animal experiments. That is, in its absolute form, the concept is anti-vivisectionist. And I think that was a widely held view in the scientific community at the time, which happily now is, at least to some extent, replaced. So his career then involved mainly, in the end, going to Reading, where he was very successful and greatly appreciated. In the 1970s, things began to change. Frame was formed by Dorothy Hegarty, who really did it on her own initiative with advice and without any reference to the Russell and Birch book. Andrew Rowan came to Frame and really established its scientific credibility, which was fantastic. And I think that was really the beginning of Frame's role as an effective part of the story. He suggested that Frame form a toxicity committee and I became its chairman, and it was years ahead of thinking in other places. The government also began to be willing to change the law and said that if organizations would get together and pool their ideas, they would listen to them. So Frame and the vets and a committee based on the House of Lords, basically, put forward some ideas which were really adopted. David Smith wrote a book on alternatives, which was one of the first mentions of alternatives. And I should have said, along the way, Andrew Rowan organized a fantastic meeting at the Royal Society in London, which was really one of the first prodigious meetings on the use of alternatives in pharmacology. David Smith wrote this book for the Research Defence Society, and he talked to a very large number of people and was really very positive on the whole about the possibility of replacement, but he also was a realist, as seen at the time, and thought that there were lots of things that could not be done. But he gave us the kind of definition of alternatives that we have today. It was Rex Birch who first really used the word alternatives. In this memo to Russell in 1954, he crossed out a word and changed it to some possible alternatives. But in the files in the archive, there's a big discussion about this, and in the end, the word alternatives was not used because Russell and U4 didn't want it used in this particular context. And it took until Smith and others came along before it really began to be used. So then, in the 1980s then, CAAT was formed, and there were new laws in various parts of the world, including Britain, in the European Union and so on, and things really began to happen. There were lots of very good international conferences were held, and ZEBET was formed in Germany, and there was a kind of an organization called ERGAT in which a small number of people got together from different European countries to see what could be done to move things forward. Meanwhile, in CAAT, there were some fantastic conferences which really were quite unique, held here every 18 months or so, I think. They really were excellent, got the best people together, and they listened to each other and put forward some great ideas. Then in the 1990s, we had what I call the age of revolution, except I'm going to call it pseudo-revolution, because the changes we hoped for didn't really happen in a way. We had a validation progress began. There was a very important report written by John Frazier for CAAT. Meanwhile, CAAT and ERGOT got together and discussed the principles of validation, how you decide independently that a method is relevant and reliable for its purpose, which is very important. We also then had a later workshop on the practical meaning of this. ECVAM was established, the European Centre for the Validation of Alternative Methods, and a few years later, ICVAM was formed in the United States. There were successful validation studies which led to changes, and another great stroke of genius was the organization in Baltimore in 1993 of the first World Congress, which was really quite amazing, which covered every aspect of what needed to be talked about, and was followed by great congresses later in Utrecht and Bologna, and others since then, of course. Meanwhile, U4 did actually publish a special edition of the principles for reasons I never quite understood. There was a marvelous event early in the 1990s when the HSUS decided to have a Russell and Birch Award. But they felt they should ask Russell and Birch, if they were still alive, if they would approve of this. And Martin Stevens came over to England and met them and actually got them together. And I like to divide the 3 R's history into the AMS, which is the anti-Martin Stevens period, and the PMS, which is the post-Martin Stevens visit, because I think everything changed then. The 3 R's suddenly became the basis for discussion and thought and action in a way which they hadn't been before. We organized a meeting, that is CAAT and ECVAM, in Sheringham in Norfolk, where Birch lived. He was too ill to travel very far, and that was extremely successful. And it was wonderful to see the two of them together. They hadn't really met each other between 1959 or so, and when Martin Stevens went to see them in the early 1990s. And this was our workshop at Amgen in 1990. We were over-optimistic, we were naive, but we did get some good thoughts down together. And this was the group which met in 95. You've got in the middle, you've got Rex Birch on the left, Claire Russell, and then Bill Russell. I don't know if I ever saw Bill Russell without the red jumper. I don't think I ever saw him without. Maybe once I saw him with a blue one, but he always looked exactly the same. Is that right, Alan? He always looks exactly the same. That was a great meeting, which led to a report. The thing about that meeting was that Russell and Birch took almost no part in it. And I'm not sure that, apart from giving wonderful, entertaining talks at meetings, and, by the way, giving enormous encouragement to those of us who were involved, I don't think Bill Russell ever really said anything new of importance about the 3 Rs, even after the publication of the book. What he did was to rejoice in the fact that so many things were going on, and the house was full of files for all of us. There was an Alan Goldberg file, a Martin Stevens file, and an Andrew Warren file, Bert Van Zutphen. All of us had a file. All the letters were there, the ones he sent, the ones he received. And you could see in them how he made each of us feel special and unique. And he made us all think we were the greatest thing in the world. So he had this wonderful ability to be enthusiastic and to convey this to other people and make them encouraged to get on and do things. And I think that was a really great achievement. This is Alan with, on the left, Bill Russell in his jumper, on the right, Rex Birch at the Sheringham Workshop in 1995. This is when Martin Stevens met Bill Russell at the Utrecht Congress in 1996 with Paul Elron from the HSUS. This is the Bologna Congress. You've got me on the left, Bill Russell, Bert Van Zutphen, Andrew Rowan, Michael Festing, and Alan Goldberg. That was a fantastic meeting, and I think we came away from that thinking we were really going to change the world. But as I'm going to try and show you in a minute, I don't think we ever really did, which is rather sad. But I'm pretty sure we came away with complete euphoria, feeling that it was all just so fantastic. We were on a high. And we'd had some really good Italian food and wine as well, which probably helped a lot. We had what's called a Declaration of Bologna, where we said that the 3 Rs were the way forward. Bill Russell signed it, Andrew Goldberg, Alan Goldberg signed it, and of course 800 other people signed it as well. And that was a beautiful piece of calligraphy, which was either provided by the HSUS or by CAAT. I'm not quite sure which one it was. This is Bill Russell in the Aula Magna of the University of Bologna. That's that's Europe's oldest university. And every time he came to one of these meetings, he sang a song in the style of Gilbert and Sullivan, in which he referred to many aspects of the 3 Rs. That was a great occasion. So I've got some personal thoughts on them. It was great that his importance was recognized after that long gap. And we have to thank the HSUS and Martin Stevens in particular for that. His enthusiasm was completely infectious. Having a letter from him or talking to him was a wonderful experience. Every time I met him or received a letter, I felt better than I had just before. I've never seen him ever say anything negative about anybody. No, I've never seen a personal comment about anybody that was negative. Even when somebody was being quite nasty to him, he could write a letter which was really welcomed what they said and so on. He had this unbelievable ability to turn what looked pretty bad into something that he saw as looking pretty good. I'm glad he didn't have major changes to the principles made, because I think there was a risk it would have been watered down and it wouldn't be what we have now. I think it may have been Martin Stevens who said somewhere what an awful book it is. It is pretty unreasonable in parts, but nevertheless, if you have the patience to read it, there is a great there. But one of the sad things which I want to come to is that many people who purport to be supporters of the 3 Rs have never ever read the book. And there are messages in there, I think, which are far more important than the 3 Rs. And I'll just briefly come to them in a moment. So then, I think things have been a bit disappointing. The enthusiasm we had in 1999 didn't lead in the next almost 20 years to the kind of breakthroughs we'd expected. Little progress has been made in terms of experimental design. I think animals are much better looked after now than they were in the past. But lots of things go on that should really be stopped because they don't work, or replaced because there are more modern ways of doing them. Just a couple of things I want to mention. One is we've had 10 years of REACH, which is the European Union system for looking at the potential toxicity of chemicals. It must have been responsible for the chopping down of a significant part of the forests of South America. The number of pages produced must be unbelievable. More animals have been used, but there's a big question. Are humans safer because of it? Is the environment better protected because of it? I think you'd find it very hard to find any evidence to support that. The other thing is drugs. We should be very grateful for what the cosmetics industry did historically in terms of supporting work on the 3 Rs. But the important thing has always been drugs, partly because of the number of animals used, but mainly because with drugs, you eventually have human data. With cosmetics and pesticides and all kinds of other things, you don't have animal data and human data. You try and extrapolate from the animal data to humans. And I think, quite honestly, that's scientifically naive and, in effect, pretty disastrous. So I think focusing on drugs is the key. Now, here's a good example of an independent report produced by people in the industry for the industry. And in between 2006 and 2015, only 9.6% of nearly 10,000 new drugs from 7,500 programs in more than 1,000 companies actually progressed from phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials into human use. About 30 of them failed because of unpredicted toxicity, and the others failed because they just didn't work in humans, even though the preclinical testing had suggested that they ought to. And now that is an inescapable fact. We can't escape from that. And those who defend the continuation of animal experimentation in any industry, but especially in the pharmaceutical industry, ought to really have answers to that. I did some work with colleagues in England. We had data on 3,000 drugs, independently collected and classified, not by us, but independently by experts. And we had rat, mouse, rabbit, human, dog, and primate data. And so we were able to do lots of comparisons. And the results show that no result in one species can tell you about the toxicity in another. It doesn't matter whether it's monkeys and humans, or dogs and humans, rats and mice even. It's just a waste of time. You might as well toss a coin and say, we think this will be safe in humans. Then you do the clinical studies and the clinical studies and see what happens. One of our problems, which occurs in this country, I know, indirectly because of some recent events, one of the problems seems to be that the industry, although it uses alternative methods in drug development, is quite prepared to accept the regulatory requirements to do dog and primate studies and so on, just because it's the easiest way to get through the process and get their products on the market, even though scientifically it would be very hard to justify the necessity for such studies. So then I think we need the true revolution now, and I hope it's going to happen. We need to recognize the mistakes that have been made. We have tended to be too willing to accept what was happening without really coming up with the kind of criticisms which we need. I'm going to miss that one out to get on. In the principles, Russell and Birch talk about models. Now, you can't model something unless you know enough about what you're modeling and you know enough about the model that you're going to use. And the fact is, in most cases, we don't. We don't know enough about human toxicology or human diseases, or about the animal models we're going to use in looking into them to know whether the results are of any value or not. It's a bit like looking into one black box to see what might happen in another one. Or put another way, it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle without a picture of what you're trying to create, and without knowing how many pieces there should be, or whether the pieces you've got are the right ones, or some of them are from other puzzles and so on. It's really important that we, and of course, I know I'm in the temple of evidence-based toxicology, and of course science should always have been evidence-based, but it's very important that in particular now in developing the alternatives, that we do it on a sound scientific basis. So models is a big thing. The second point in the principles is the high fidelity fallacy. Just because animals are like us in many ways doesn't mean they're sufficiently like us to be models for us. And this is particularly important with drugs, where the enzymes involved in drug metabolism are just completely different from ours. There is no way in which the dog can really be useful in terms of potential human toxicity, because what's going to happen in the dog will be so different from what might happen in the human. And the third point, which is not really taken sufficiently into account, is human variation. A lot of the human volunteer studies involve healthy young males, but most of the patients who are going to have the drugs aren't healthy, they aren't young, and they aren't male. And they also have, of course, conditions which complicate the effects of the drugs anyway. So we need much more of a focus on individual human patients rather than on thinking that there's such a thing as the human being who's kind of typical. So the mistakes are still being made. We haven't really appreciated the main message in the principles, and I think that is something that could be redressed. A lot of people say they support the 3 Rs, but really do little about it. We accept animal tests and animal studies as being valid without really the evidence to support it. And almost worst of all is we accept the data from animal studies as a basis for evaluating the relevance and reliability of the alternative methods, which is crazy if you think of it. And by the way, one of the things which is nice about being retired is you can say things without all the pressures which limit what you have to say when you're working. You're kind of free to let yourself go, as it were. So what's going to happen, I think, is this. We need to realize that animal welfare is not the only issue. We're really talking about a human welfare issue. If the drugs don't work, then human patients who need treatment aren't getting it. And huge resources are wasted on things which don't come through the development and clinical testing to actually come into use. So I think we have to have a view of humanity in general rather than focusing on animal welfare versus human welfare. What is good for animals is probably good for humans as well. Reduce animal use because the results aren't really worthwhile. Increase your investment on what you could do with humans instead. I think we should stop talking about replacement, because we're not trying to replace animal experiments. Whether they're conducted or not is a completely separate issue which should be discussed. What we need to do is to develop methods which have a sound mechanistic basis using modern techniques, where we identify the questions which need to be asked and find ways of answering them which are directly relevant to humans, rather than involving the need for the kind of extrapolations which we've had to put up with in the past. So now we've got a big range of alternatives. We recently discussed them in a book in which had a number of chapters from CAAT and IIVS. There's a huge amount of knowledge around now, but it needs to be channeled so that we can have methods which are likely to be useful in different circumstances. We need a whole set of strategies which are appropriate to specific situations, rather than believing that one kind of approach will suit everything. So I think what's going to happen is that the methods will be used selectively and in combination in ways which are relevant to specific circumstances. And I think what's going to happen, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, is that you'll have study directors who will have to be able to consider a whole range of potential ways forward and select the best ones, and then have the experience and the ability to assess the results they get and how they might help us to get better drugs for use in humans faster and more successfully than is possible at the moment. And regulators also will have to be able to consider not a kind of a checklist standard approach to things. They will have to also be good scientists who will be able to evaluate complex and specific circumstances in ways which are appropriate. There's an interesting book I just came across, which is called The Perils of Perception. It turns out if you ask people what they think about things, what they think, their perceptions are almost always entirely wrong. We think we know things, but if you look at the actual information, the fact is we often don't. Now, I was a bit shocked by this graph, which is about who do you kind of trust to tell you the truth. I can understand why politicians and journalists are at the bottom. And having been a civil servant as well as a scientist, I can understand why civil servants are okay. I can't really see how scientists get to be at the top. I would put scientists probably between civil servants and journalists, rather than in a high position. And I say that seriously in the sense that I think we have to be very careful not to kind of try and persuade the public with complex information and seeming expertise. We have to face up to the challenges. I just wonder if I should finish with my piece I thought of this morning. Do you want to hear what I thought of this morning? I think for 60 years, having started in a pretty awful position, if you look back on it, far too many animals were being used in ways which weren't appropriate in badly designed experiments, and we weren't really getting the progress in medical research that we should have done. So I think what we've been doing is gradually climbing a mountain to get out of that. And in so doing, we've been exposed, as we climbed this complex mountain, to all kinds of hazards. We've had to face up to all kinds of different risks. Some people have fallen out along the way. Some of them have died. There have been some great people, Russell and Birch, Dorothy Hegarty founded Frame, Bjorn Ekvall, some of us know, and others. And of course, happily, an increasing number of young people are joining us. So the throng going up the mountain is increasing. We aren't at the top yet, but I think we can now see over at what is beyond. And like Moses and the Israelites, we can get a glimpse of the promised land which is beyond, the land full of milk and honey, the land with meadows and woods and streams and lakes, and lovely villages with church towers and spires. Okay. But I feel a little bit like Moses, and I think Bill Russell probably would have done as well. We aren't going to go down the other side of the mountain into the promised land. Other people will do that. There will be Joshuas who will take over from us. And they will have to face up to different kinds of hazards and risks as they go down. But I think they'll get there in the end. I was a bit concerned about saying this, about having Joshuas take over as leaders, because that sounds a bit sexist. But it turns out I found that in a survey which showed that about 1.25 million males had been called Joshua, about 3,000 female children had also been called Joshua. So I'm going to claim at this moment that by saying that the Joshuas are going to take over, that would include men and women. So I think my time is coming to an end. I'm looking over at the promised land. I think you'll get there, and I just want you to know that I will be behind you all the way, and I hope, and I'm sure you will, one day succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Wonderful and comprehensive view on 6 decades of the 3 R's, which we are celebrating at this moment. I have to say I was a bit disappointed that you called the era when I took over from you the era of disappointment. But I'm very glad that you can perceive the era which is in front of us and to which I hope to still contribute as the era of the real revolution. Okay. I think you will have many questions for him, and I don't want to consume the time myself. Please.
I'm actually infatuated by the slide that's on the screen right now, so this is a bit of a tangential comment. Risk perception is one of my hobbies back home. I don't see physicians on that chart. They typically rank higher than anybody consistently across the board.
Yeah, that isn't my slide, of course. That just happens to be in the book. I think physicians would be extremely high, because the truth is you can't afford not to trust your doctor, really, can you? You can afford not to trust politicians, and there's the good evidence you probably should. Now, I think physicians would be high, but my problem is that I spend a lot of time looking at newspapers, looking at the claims being made. There are all kinds of claims that, we're going to live for 150 years, or things are, 1 week a glass of red wine every day is good for your heart, the next week it's lethal. I think scientists play all kinds of games to get support and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things about Russell and Birch and other people in this field, they have been willing to face up to some pretty complex situations. So I don't want to trivialize what goes on. I have a lot of sympathy, in fact, for the drug companies, and there are many good scientists there. But sometimes things are really very difficult. Anyway, sorry, didn't really answer the question.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much, Jack Fowle. I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on what you think the proper role of scientists who wish to promote the 3 Rs is in terms of working with the regulators to understand the problems the regulators face, but also to provide sort of support and training in a caring, non-threatening way, both early and throughout the whole process where the alternative approaches might be adopted to sort of maximize the likelihood that they will be accepted and used in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I've always been impressed by C.P. Snow, and he gave the Godkin lectures at Harvard, probably in the 1960s, and he distinguished between scientists and administrators. Scientists want to have a view of the future. We're always working for something. When we've got more knowledge, more will be possible. Whereas administrators are trying to manage things as they are today. And the regulators are really administrators. Their job is to see what's put before them, make decisions about it according to the procedures of the time. But what we should be doing is looking for that promised land, looking ahead to a different time. And we should try and do it in a way which doesn't imply unnecessary criticism of the way things are done now. So the best regulators, and there are some, who are very interested in what would be possible as a different way of what's doing what's being done now. But there are others who are rather content to want to continue with the way things are. We've had people say, for example, about alternative tests. We've had regulators say they understand the Dre's eye test, but they don't really understand the alternatives, and they're happy to continue having the Dre's eye test done because it's been useful and so on and so forth. So I think we have to handle this sensitively and carefully, and in a way which isn't unnecessarily critical of those with different responsibilities now, while we work on possibilities for the year ahead. But in the case of the drug statistics, it was in 2004 that the FDA said only 8% of drugs get through clinical trials, and the industry had to rely on other modern methods and not so much on animals. That was the FDA. And I think one of my disappointments is that 2004 was 15 years ago, and I still know people in the States who are being told they must do a dog study with a new drug, even though they have evidence that the drug study could not give information they could use in evaluating what would affect in humans. So this is what I mean by the disappointment.
I think, this is not my question, but I think there's more optimism now in bridging the two cultures of C.P. Snow than there had been in the past. And I think we see often in our activities a lot more interest from both sides, from the scientific culture and from the regulatory one, of working together, which always makes things easier if if you don't have to just denigrate the other side, but actually try and see their purpose at the same time. So I think I'm a bit optimistic on that. My question was going to be on Bill Russell. did he actually have an experimental side of his scientific life, or was most of it on the theoretical end?
He worked on the mating behavior of xenopus for his PhD. So yes, he did. He didn't. His work would have been. His thesis was about behavior and its endocrine basis. I haven't seen his thesis, but I wonder. I can't imagine that he did a lot of kind of endocrine experiment, kind of measurements. I think he was an observer. He was a thinker, and an analyst more than somebody who was practically involved. I think, yeah, that could be, by the way, one of the reasons why he found it difficult to find a job. There weren't, maybe at that time, the kind of departments which maybe began to come along, where there was a different kind of approach to things. When I started out, using animals was the norm. You had to have a signature from a president of a Royal College and a president of a medical society. I went along to a senior president, I think, of the Physiological Society. I told him what I wanted to do. He pulled out a piece of paper. He said, "No, look, this is what we put on the form. This lets us do everything." That was the way it was. Things have changed happily. We're not much more. I'm probably what you would call a pessimistic optimist. Deep down, I'm optimistic. But I think over-optimism in the face of today limits you from looking sufficiently carefully at what needs to be done to satisfy your deeper down optimism. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but so.
Nicole Kleinstreuer, ICVAM NICEDM Deputy Director. Thank you so much for the talk. That was fascinating. I think from our perspective, one of the major constraints of moving the needle forward in terms of regulatory progress and application of the 3 Rs and alternatives are the legal frameworks and the legislative mandates that are really the stranglehold in the decision-making process and in using new approaches. And so I wondered if you might comment on the role of 3 Rs advocates, probably more outside of the federal government, that have the opportunity to assist in science communication and helping the politicians, untrusted as they may be, actually understand the pitfalls of the current situation and the opportunities that exist for changing funding structures and changing legal frameworks that the regulatory agencies operate under.
I can't hear you very well, but one of the things that has happened, which is really very encouraging, is that when going back to, say, 1959, when the book was published, there were anti-vivisectionists and people who did important medical research. I think that's all changed because the so-called anti-vivisection organizations now have scientists, good scientists working with them. They make statements which are credible. They're involved in discussions. There are lots of good things going on in that sense. And I do believe that we have a problem with explaining things to the people. I don't know what's happening here, except I know a little bit. We have a big problem with vaping, okay? Now, in our parliament, we have virtually no scientists, a bit like yours, almost all lawyers. And lawyers can't really talk about the risks of vaping. So I think we need certain things. You need the highest possible quality discussion among people who have different views to try and get to something which we could call the truth. I'm really quite interested in the truth. It's a very interesting philosophy. One person's truth is another person's lie, of course, but I do believe that there are issues which we will only be able to deal with if we're able to talk about them openly together in detail. And I think, demanding that dogs be used in a drug study because they've always been used, I really don't think that's good enough. And that's not being anti-regulators. That surely, well, if it is, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it anyway. But that kind of thing still goes on. Does that help your question at all, or was it a different question?
I think we can pursue this later at the dinner also. Andrew.
Michael, in terms of the promised land, I've been tracking the numbers over the years, and you saw the numbers in the UK or Great Britain go up and then come down, and now they've been going up again because of the GMO mouse revolution. But the last couple of years, I've seen it begin to tick down, and I've been predicting that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And so, could you talk about that in terms of the Harlow and Sanger decision?
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, the numbers, of course, you have to look in detail as well. The numbers have come down in certain uses, but the numbers in basic research, I don't think have really come down. They've come down in a lot of, applied circumstances. I'm not personally, I've never really been concerned that the numbers matter. I think what matters is the scientific justification and so on, and I think we ought to look at that. There's a huge problem, by the way, with experimental design, which Russell and Birch go on about at great length. Their chapter on reduction is almost unreadable. I did try and summarize it, and Michael Festing, who's one of the experts, said I hadn't done a bad job. If you have a look at that chapter, it is really pretty tough going. All about, experimental design. But it's not, I don't know what happens here, but most scientists have never really been trained in how to do experiments, have they? They just kind of go ahead and do them. It's good if numbers come down, and of course the big increase was because of the genetically modified animals. That kind of covered up other trends.
Good. Okay, I think you have seen a wonderful presentation getting us started in 2 exciting days to follow of our board meeting, and also then on the festivities for 60 years of the 3 Rs. I'm especially grateful that you not only did highlight the contribution of Russell and Birch 60 years ago, but that you also showed how many people were involved in this and how much of this was intertwined, collaborative. I always like to call this the family, the CAAT family, but also the family of alternative methods with people going from in between the institutions and collaborating here. I was especially grateful that you also mentioned quite broadly the contributions by CAAT, and I'm singling out here Alan Goldberg for one specific reason, because he's spending today his 80th birthday with us. I'm very grateful for this. And I think this is also acknowledging the fact that you are here, the importance, what this means for us, to really spend time with us and share your lessons learned. We're going to continue on Friday, as the lessons many of the people who are involved are sharing. You have heard some of the names, some more are joining us by then. I hope you will come and join us. For those participating in the board and invited to our board dinner, there will be at 5:30 a bus leaving at the Monument Street entrance. So this is the modern entrance of the building. There will be a bus bringing us to dinner. I would like to thank you for coming for our keynote speaker. I would like to thank those on the web who are following this in a stream. We know it is often not possible to come for a single keynote lecture, and that's why we're very grateful that we have a larger audience to follow this. On Friday, we will also stream and we will record and deposit this on our web, so there's the opportunity for everybody to follow up. Thank you very much, Michael, once again, and let's enjoy our evening among friends and family.